So I think we might just wait a minute or two to let people join, but we're very excited to welcome you here today for the first in our beauty webinar series, Getting Clean Beauty Advertising Right. Okay, so I'm going to get started. Welcome. We're really excited to have you here today, and we're delighted with the enthusiasm that we got in registrations for this webinar series, part of our BBB National Programs Live series, and the first of a series of webinars on beauty and beauty advertising. Our goal with the series is to help beauty businesses build a more trusted relationship with consumers. Building consumer trust in business is one of the core things that we do at BBB National Programs. We're the home of over a dozen self-regulatory programs that build trust with consumers in advertising, privacy, and dispute resolution. Although many of you are familiar with BBB National Programs and our National Advertising Division, or either our privacy or dispute resolution programs, but for those of you who are not familiar with us, I want to give you a brief history of how advertising self-regulation began. So we're going to move, next slide, please. So I'm going to leave the introductions to Annie. So we'll come back to that page in just a couple of minutes. But to set the stage for how advertising self-regulation got started, it all began in 1971. And three things came together that created this opportunity for what is essentially an aspirational self-regulatory program and a voluntary one to really take hold and provide tremendous benefits to businesses over a 50+ year history. First, you had the growth of a new media, television, that demonstrated the power of advertising to reach and influence consumers. There was a tremendous amount of awareness of how much advertising was influencing consumer purchases. Then we also had a growth of skepticism of that medium and advertising specifically. 1971 not only was the year that advertising self-regulation was founded, but it is also the same year that cigarette advertising was banned on television, because there was this awareness that it was having a huge influence on consumers smoking, and there was awareness that smoking was really bad for consumers' health. While you have this growth in new media and skepticism, we also had this growing idealism. And it's really exemplified by this 1971 commercial, a Coca-Cola commercial that some of you may remember, which featured women and men of different colors and races and dressed in different kinds of clothing, singing about how they'd like to teach the world to sing in peace and harmony. So it really was this moment of idealism where consumers felt like they had the power to change the world, and consumers were using that power and advocating for additional regulation of advertising. Next slide, please. So that moment led to the creation of the U.S. system of self-regulation. So the leading advertising industry associations, the Association of National Advertising, the ANA, the 4As, and the AAF, came together and said, we're going to self-regulate. Rather than see additional regulation, we're going to create this system of self-regulation. They wanted to provide a meaningful way for competitors, industries, and consumer groups to really just increase the truthfulness of advertising and hold advertising to consistent standards for truthfulness. So what we have now is the system of self-regulation that allows businesses, advertising advocacy organizations, or NAD itself to review the truthfulness of advertising and hold it to standards that are set by the FTC for truth in advertising. We open cases. We ask an advertiser to substantiate their advertising claims. There's usually an exchange of briefs back and forth and evidence. And then we write recommendations for changes that are voluntary, but almost always followed 90 to 95% of the time. This voluntary system gets the strong support of the Federal Trade Commission, because we actually expand the work of the Federal Trade Commission by applying their standards to industries where they might just not be able to reach given their limited resources. We've also, over the last several years, been reaching out to platforms to get them to support advertising self-regulation. We have a public partnership with Meta where we can refer advertising to them that doesn't meet our truth in advertising standards, and they'll review it against their platform policy standards. And we're working with other platforms as well. So today, I think we're in a similar moment than as we were in the 1971, in the 1970s. You have a growth of a new media here, digital media, social media, and of course, down the pipe we see the AI, the metaverse come barreling at us. And at the same time, we have some skepticism arriving over advertising claims and whether or not advertising claims are supported, or what the source of advertising is, and who's communicating with us. Is it advertising or not? And also this kind of distrust of conformance claims that are touted by influencers or even in consumer reviews. But we also have some of the idealism that we had in the 1970s, where consumers feel empowered by the digital information they have access to, and they're learning things about the products they purchase. They have access to information in a way that they never did before, and they're looking for ways to do things like minimize their impact on the environment or avoid using potentially harmful ingredients. We have the same moment, and we really do hope through educational platforms like this, that we have a re-embrace of advertising self-regulation. Right now, as we're looking at the beauty industry, we know that consumers will forge strong bonds with the beauty brands that they use and follow, which makes it even more important for beauty brands to build a trusted relationship with their consumers. And we want to be part of building that relationship with consumers. We want you to look to us as a resource for how to build a trusted relationship with your consumers. Make sure you know the rules of the road for truth in advertising, but also make sure that those standards are applied across the board and not just for companies that are following the rules. So today, your panelists are going to talk to you about clean beauty. That's a claim that consumers and brands are really seizing on. But if it's going to be valuable and if it's going to build trust with consumers, it has to mean something. It has to mean something that resonates with consumers, but also is something that consumers understand and understand truthfully. I'm going to turn this now over to our panelists, and specifically Annie Ugalayan, our Deputy Director, who has nearly 20 years of experience reviewing advertising claims, and specifically in the beauty space for the National Advertising Division, and let her lead you through some what we hope is very educational information on making beauty claims, specifically clean beauty claims, and getting them right. Annie, you can take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. And I want to welcome all of you to this webinar on clean beauty. I'm delighted to have Amelia and Roni join us today to unpack this hot topic. So I'll start with some introductions and then we will dive right in. Roni Schmeltz is a partner at K&L Gates's Los Angeles office and a member of the commercial disputes practice. After spending this part of her career as a litigator, the first part of her career as a litigator, Roni now splits her time between defending companies in litigation with a particular focus on consumer class action defense and counseling companies on litigation avoidance strategies designed to reduce the risk of regulatory oversight and consumer challenges. She acts as outside general counsel to a number of personal care and beauty companies, helping them implement best practices for, among other things, complying with regulations and standards enforced by the FDA, FTC, and other federal and state regulatory agencies, and the NAD, as well as ways to reduce exposure to consumer class actions. Roni also continues to defend clients in nationwide consumer class actions and complex commercial litigation matters. She's actively involved with numerous beauty trade organizations and serves on the boards of the Independent Beauty Association and Beauty Industry West. She's a graduate of UCLA and the University of California, Hastings College of Law. Amelia McKee Vassallo is a partner in Ballard Spahr's litigation department, where she routinely represents clients facing claims related to false advertising, both from the consumer and the competitor perspectives. Additionally, she counsels clients on compliance matters, claim substantiation issues, and litigation avoidance measures. In addition to her litigation practice, Amelia maintains a robust internal investigations and government enforcement related practice. So next slide, please. So here's a roadmap of just under an hour. Amelia is going to go through sort of the landscape of the clean beauty space, how this undefined term is used in this growing marketplace. Roni will then explain the litigation risk associated with this claim, along with some sister claims. And then I will provide some relevant case examples, including freedom of claims, seals and certifications, and then we're going to have a discussion and leave you with some takeaways for best practices. So Amelia, why don't you walk us through this landscape?
Sure, happy to do so. Thanks, Annie. If we can go to the next slide. Thanks so much. So my job is to really set the table, to give us a background, so that as Roni and Annie talk about the cases today, we know about the marketplace that we're talking about, and really so that I can help us answer the question, why should we care about what we're talking about today? Although I suspect that everybody on this call today knows why we should care and is really confronted with these claims on a daily basis. So the U.S. clean beauty market comprises about 10 or grew about 10% in 2022, and is expected to grow over the years to come. Now, Laura discussed the idea of trust among consumers in this industry, and the importance of trust among consumers. And what studies have shown is that about 91% of consumers would like more transparency about what constitutes clean beauty, or quote unquote clean beauty. Because what I can tell you, and what we all know, is that there is no one definition of what constitutes quote unquote clean beauty. There's no reg I can point to. There's no one definition. And rather, what you will see as we talk about the market or the industry is that each individual company, each individual brand has a different definition of what constitutes clean. And in some cases, it really is undefined what a clean product is or what constitutes quote unquote clean. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the market in 2022, this was a $7.2 billion with a B market. By 2028, it's estimated that this market will double and be about $14.3 billion in size. When I say these claims are everywhere, I mean that they truly are everywhere. I would venture to guess that you see them in your daily travels. A New York Times article estimated that about 1/3 of the market is now labeled as clean. Laura also referenced social media. I'm a huge social media fan. And you can see that these claims are used on Instagram with the hashtag clean beauty being used on 5.6 million Instagram posts, on 1.2 billion TikTok videos. They're being used by influencers, they're being used by companies, they're being used everywhere. If we can go to the next slide, and we'll start to look at how companies have defined clean beauty. As I mentioned, there's no one definition. Whole Foods is an example of how a company has strove to define what clean is to them. And they have gone out in the market and they have said, this is what clean is to us. This is what our standard is. And to Whole Foods, it's to the lack of 215 ingredients in their products. They have banned 215 ingredients in their products that they have defined as clean. And they will list the ingredients. They will say, this is what we will not have in our products that we have defined as clean beauty. Let's go to the next slide, please. Other companies, Credo, for example, goes beyond just the lack of certain ingredients. And they look at ethics or safety, how they source the products, sustainability, the transparency that they want to provide to their consumers. When you're purchasing a product, you know that it has not been sourced from certain companies or certain distribution chains, that you know that it's sustainably sourced, that you know that it's been ethically sourced. And they will list these promises to their consumers on their website. So you know that you're getting more than just a lack of ingredient in the product. And so to Credo, it means more than just a lack of ingredient in the product. But it's still the same claim. It's still quote unquote clean. But clean is different to Credo than it is to Whole Foods. And this is where some of the ambiguity in the market comes in, even though it's still technically the same claim. If we can go to the next slide, please. And these claims are used in different media. They're used on websites. You can see here you have the clean beauty claim made with a seal of sorts, right? They're used prominently. We are clean beauty. We formulate only clean and natural ingredients. If we can go to the next slide, please. They're used in the product descriptions. Turn up the volume while keeping it clean. Choose well, play clean. They're used on product labels. We can go to the next slide. When we say clean, we mean it. They're used alongside of different seals. For example, the EWG verified, the Environmental Working Group. They're used along seals that say that they're cruelty free. And they're also used, if we can go to the next slide, please, among seals like clean at Sephora, which is what Rhodey's going to talk about in a couple of minutes when we talk about the clean at Sephora related litigation. But you can see the variety of ways in which these clean claims are made. And when you look at them, they're the same claim that the product is quote unquote clean. But when you know that different companies are defining clean differently, you have to take a step back and wonder how is the company defining clean? And then what is a consumer to take from the claim clean? And with that, I'll hand it over to Roni, who will talk about the litigation related issues that these claims have raised.
Thanks, Amelia, and good day to everybody. So clean litigation. As you see here, clean is meant and means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, as you see from this word cloud. And it's being used in a bunch of different ways. But I wanted to put natural up here and clean because, next slide, please. I've been saying for years now that clean is the new natural. And what do I mean by that? I mean that natural is an undefined term. There's no regulatory definition. Try as industry has to get the FDA to focus on this and to try to give us a regulatory definition. There is no definition for natural. The same holds true for clean. And so unfortunately, given this regulatory vacuum, there's nothing like a vacuum like this that the consumer lawyers love to drive into and instead say, well, there's no regulatory definition, so let us, consumer lawyers, tell you what consumers think it means. And that spawned, over the last decades, starting in the food area, hundreds of lawsuits, class action lawsuits, challenging the use of the term natural. And here we just give you a few examples. And the reason for this is to show you, why should we care? Why there's no regulatory definition for clean? Why do we care that companies are using it in different ways and explaining why? And the reason we care is because it can be very expensive if we use marketing terms in a way that is leaving it open to the consumer lawyers to drive a truck through in order to challenge us on false advertising bases. And so here are just a few examples of how painful it was to go through this birth and development of challenges to the term natural when used in cosmetics. And what we know is that the plaintiffs bar, in the absence of a regulatory definition, have defined the term natural to mean a product that contains absolutely no artificial or synthetic ingredients and that goes through minimal, if any, processing. So basically what the consumer bar wants everybody to understand and believe is that natural, if you use that term in itself, is basically communicating that the product is all natural or 100% natural and contains no synthetic ingredient. Doing so all the time when there's absolutely no support for their interpretation. Nonetheless, because it's very expensive to litigate and not to take a chance on losing, all the companies by and far that have sued thus far have settled. And these are the expensive settlements that you can see. Clean, here you see for the Honest Company, back in the day settled for $7.35 million. And so that there is absolutely no confusion as to why these settlements come through and why these cases are filed. It is for the enormous attorney's fees that are being recouped by these lawyers. $2.45 million in this case, where the consumer gets pennies on the dollar for what they paid. There was another challenge I'm going to talk about, free of claims, but the natural products claim in that settlement was basically there were synthetic ingredients, so it's not natural. Free of, they detected some SLS, and that resulted in another settlement of 1.55 million. Next slide, please. Here's just another one where we see not only is it money that's going out the door, but Avena Actives, as part of this rather expensive settlement, had to agree to injunctive relief and had to stop using active naturals on the front of the packaging, and on the side, if it was going to continue to use natural, it had to disclose that in fact there were some synthetic and unnatural ingredients contained in the product. But again, you see very rich settlements and very sweet attorney's fees, which is what keeps motivating the consumer bar. Next slide, please. Here's an example, and I brought this up in part to show the evolution of how we've been dealing with claims over the decades that have been challenging the natural claims. In this case, as you can see from the top visual, Tom's of Maine used to be Tom's of Maine Natural Care, as you see at the top. And they marketed a myriad of different consumer products using that tagline and that logo. And at the end of the day, they got challenged. It was an NAD proceeding, but that spawned, and later on, there were also litigations that were filed, class action lawsuits. And what you see here in terms of the evolution, what is acceptable is NAD really determined that they would stop using the natural term, but in addition to that, they would have more disclosures on their website about what they meant by use of the term natural to market its products. A very expensive settlement, and unfortunately for Tom's, this was just the beginning of many lawsuit challenges in the courts, and later on, actually, also with NAD. So there's been an evolution as to whether or not, is it okay if we just take off naturals alone, or if we just explain more on our website, will that alone do it? Well, it hasn't worked in the natural space as those cases continue to get filed, and we unfortunately are going to see that these are not working in the clean space either. Next slide, please. Which brings us to the clean lawsuits. As Amelia already mentioned, Clean at Sephora is one that is top of mind right now, primarily because it is currently pending. So next slide, please. We talked earlier about the fact, there is no definition for clean or for natural, and the need, as Amelia said, for transparency. And that's something Laura also spoke to. I don't think that there could have been a better way to try to explain and give transparency than what Sephora tried to do here. Sephora has a seal that it uses in order to have its Clean at Sephora line of products. And it explains in signage on the website and the like what it means by clean, since there is no definition. So it's telling the consumer, this is what we mean by clean. It means that it's formulated without, and it lists the different types of ingredients that are no longer in there. And it explains what the ethos is behind this and what they're trying to communicate to consumers in order to attract them to this portion of their store. Notwithstanding the definition clearly being given and the transparency that was related, the consumer lawyers once again have come forward and basically said, well, that's not how we view what it means to be clean. As far as we're concerned, the lawyers say, all consumers think that if you're going to use the term clean, you got to go by your dictionary definition, and it means something, as you see, inconsistent with no impurities, nothing harmful, and the like. What's interesting, this case is currently pending. The motion to dismiss has been fully briefed, and we're waiting for a determination from the court. What's interesting is that the lawyer who filed this lawsuit also had filed a different lawsuit, basically the same thing, different product. In that case, it was a pure protein drink. But what was very nice in that case, which was dismissed, was the court's noting that plaintiff fails to plausibly allege that the product packaging made any statement or representation that it contained no processed, synthetic, or artificial ingredients. Indeed, she cannot. Nowhere on the labeling does defendant make a sweeping representation that the product contains no processed, synthetic, or artificial ingredients. And that's a critical point, and I think a way in which to be going after and defending against these cases. Sephora is telling the consumer exactly what it means when it says clean at Sephora. It's not making any representations or promises beyond that. And so the question becomes, and the standard in courts is whether it's reasonable, a significant number of reasonable consumers acting reasonably under the circumstances would walk away with the definition that is being espoused here in advance by the consumer lawyer. And quite frankly, the answer should be no. No reasonable consumer acting reasonably under the circumstances should walk away with a definition for clean other than the one that Sephora has clearly communicated to them. Remains to be seen whether or not the court will see it that way. Let's move to the next slide, please. Now, when we talk about clean, there are close cousins to this, not only using the word clean to describe a product line, but also oftentimes we talk about being free of certain compounds. And that has spawned a lot of lawsuits most recently that we've seen with PFAS. And hopefully everybody's familiar with this. I'm not going to pronounce for you what PFAS, the acronym, stands for. Those with scientific background, and I know some of you are on this phone, could do so much better than I. But they are basically forever chemicals as they're described. They are everywhere, ubiquitous. It's hard to escape them. And what ended up happening was that there have been these third-party companies that have been going out and conducting lab tests of different types of products. And in this case, it was one done in 2021, as you see referenced here, fluorinated compounds in North American cosmetics, a study which detected a lot, according to them, of cosmetics with different types of exposure to PFAS. And what the plaintiff's lawyers have been doing is relying on these third-party sites, studies that have been done. And they basically go after brands, they pull a bunch of brands of different products and they test them. Then the consumer lawyers relying upon those go out and challenge these free of product campaigns. But it's more than just the claims that are being made on the product labels. They're actually looking at the entire marketing campaign being advanced by these companies. And Bare Essentials is one that was attacked not only for what it was saying, and not only for the fact that there were PFAS that were detected, but it really was because there were PFAS detected, which flies in the face, consumer lawyers argue, about the image that you're trying to convey. And Bare Essentials fancy themselves as the creators of clean beauty, talks all over the place about being fresh, free of harsh chemicals, unnecessary additives. The brand name itself, the consumer lawyers argue, Bare plus minimal, is designed to convey these are clean, natural, synthetic-free ingredients and the like. So coupling the entire messaging and DNA of the brand, along with claiming something is free of, plaintiffs argue, well, if that's the case, then you should never see a PFAS in these products. Now, it's important to understand, in most all of these cases, PFAS was never intentionally added to these products. It's not on the ingredient list because it's not an ingredient that's added to these formulations to make these products. Instead, these are contaminants that at the end of the day have been found in these products through the testing. But it's very important to understand that there is a lot of debate, critical debate, over the methodologies that have been used to conduct its test, whether or not it's okay to just rely on detecting fluorinated the organic fluoride and just to be able to extrapolate, well, if I find the fluoride there, therefore PFAS must be there. So you've got a testing methodology question. You've got whether or not it accurately reflects the levels of PFAS which are in the product. But most critically beyond that is, even if you found them, there's no evidence beyond these grandiose references to the New York Times articles or EWG or some studies, but not complete studies, arguing that these are unsafe in the levels in which they're detected in the product. So you've got a methodology for testing, which is questionable, and whether or not, even if there is a level of PFAS found in the product as determined by these third parties, is that enough to cause a safety concern? Because what we know from all of these cases is that these consumers are relying upon these third-party tests. They are not conducting testing of their own product. They are not alleging that their own products that they use tested positive for PFAS, and they are not alleging that they suffered any injury or damage as a result of using a product which may or may not have had PFAS in it. They've met with conflicting determinations when you have these kinds of cases. Right now, in this case, in the Solis case, this was a little bit different in so far as at the end of the day, it actually did turn out, actually, let's turn to the next one. The cleanup, the Bare Minerals case. In this case, by the way, the motion to dismiss had been granted originally in the Bare Minerals case. There is a new first amendment complaint that's been filed, and that is now being argued through a motion to dismiss as well. So the next one we come to is clean of. Here we have one, again, free of, in this case, found to have PFAS in it, but this case is a little bit different. Again, it's relying upon the genre and the whole ethos that CoverGirl is trying to convey about who they are. We're safe, we're sustainable, we hold ourselves out to a certain level. And that is what they used in order to make the argument that how can you be all of these things? That's false and misleading advertising because we found PFAS. And in this case, critically, there was on the ingredient label the presence of one PFAS, one of the, in the family of PFAS, one that's PTFE, a Teflon, which the court then saw, because it was listed on the ingredient list, there was disclosure of the fact that there might be PFAS in here, and the court went ahead and dismissed the complaint, and it settled soon thereafter. Next slide, please. And yet, once again, another class action complaint, this one looking again at all of the things that are being said. In this case, it was the safety and also being attacked because there were undetected PFAS in here. It's an eye product, closer to the eye, they argue, is a bigger safety issue. But again, critically, these safety concerns that are being raised are on third-party testing results, no real substantiation that the products at issue cause any safety concern, and certainly no factual allegation of any damage or injury to the consumer plaintiffs. This is the same firm that brought another case, and the whole complaint goes through a litany of all of the history of PFAS and why it's terrible, and so on and so forth, with very little to be able to tie that history to the product and to a viable claim. Motion to dismiss is pending in this case as well. Next slide, please. And yet another close cousin to free of and PFAS and the like, or things that we're seeing here. And again, this was based upon a third party going out and testing a bunch of different products. In this case, a company called Valashore. And they went out and determined that there was a bunch of benzene and a number of dry shampoo products. Interestingly, again, if you read the report, it's almost self-contradictory. It's not that every time they took a particular product and sprayed it, that there was a level of benzene detected. It depended upon when in the spray cycle they tested it, depended upon whether it tested positive. The same product could test low or medium or high. It varied, which in itself shows that not every product contained the benzene. Again, same scenario here where the plaintiff's bar tries to piggyback off of this third party. Complaints are being filed, but notably, the courts are noting in some instances that there's no evidence that the ones that were actually purchased and used by the plaintiffs themselves contained any benzene. There's no even allegation to that effect. The only question is whether or not it actually plausibly could be that case. There was another case where the court actually, based upon that against Bayer, said, no allegation in the complaint you tested this product or that there was any injury here. On that basis, no standing, dismisses the complaint. That is on appeal. But here you have the exact opposite conclusion reached by this court, where it concluded that, yeah, relying on the Valashore, and they did test some of these products, that was enough to nudge it from being just a theoretical plausibility to being to something conceivably that could happen to, yeah, okay, we'll take it as plausible. So again, we're seeing the courts come down in a manner that isn't very supportive of the normal process that you would think you'd have to follow in the court case, which is you're going to allege damage based upon a product or injury. You better have tested and shown me that that product is the issue. And in here, at least at the motion to dismiss stage, courts are allowing these cases to proceed based upon these third parties, which in and of itself then triggers usually a settlement and no ultimate resolution on any of these issues. Next slide, and then with this is the final of my portion of the presentation. Just wanted to show industry is pushing back a little bit. Those of you, unfortunately, there may be many on the phone because there have been hundreds of companies that have been sued under Prop 65, where I am here in California, finding that titanium dioxide is present in the products and it's listed on Prop 65. Therefore, you have to have a disclosure under the Prop 65 warning label. What's interesting is that titanium dioxide was listed on Prop 65 back in 2011, however, in a very narrow category, airborne, unbound, respirable portions that could be inhaled and therefore could cause problems. The pressed powders that are typically at issue in all of these notices are not unbound. Yet once again, plaintiff's bar has gone out, found themselves a scientist of sort who has gone out and tested by its own methodology, a very questionable methodology, that it has determined that yes, there are in fact titanium dioxide present in this product and that's respirable and therefore a warning is required. The FDA pushed back on the testing methodology Valashore used, the PCPC pushed back, and finally PCPC went even further. And recently, just in the last month or so, filed a lawsuit against the California Attorney General, alleging that it shouldn't even be on the list. There is absolutely no evidence that titanium dioxide, when it is bound, creates any sort of safety risk. The basis upon which this was used in order to put it under Prop 65 doesn't apply scientifically. You can't extrapolate that the injuries to the mice were going to cause the injury to the consumers and well. Basically, to illustrate to you that the issues that are presented by these clean claims, free of claims, and the like, is that you are, because there is no definition and there's no standards in it, the plaintiff's bar is taking that absence and that void and creating and trying to impose its own standards. Hopefully, at least with regard to PFAS, there might be some relief because under the recently passed MOCRA, FDA has been charged with the obligation to figure out what is the story with PFAS? Is it safe to be in cosmetics? And if so, at what levels? And as those of us that litigate, presumably will be arguing at the fore, that should take it out of the realm of litigation. And before somebody can sue for a PFAS being a problem in any cosmetic, we say primary jurisdiction, Your Honor, you need to stay this case. FDA is charged, required legislatively to address this issue. Do not substitute your judicial inclinations for what the FDA is charged to do scientifically to determine whether PFAS is it really an issue, or it is just the fad du jour that the consumer lawyers have come up with to try to create new avenues to get attorney fees. With that, back to you, Annie.
Great, thank you so much, Roni. So Laura mentioned this earlier, but advertisers are responsible for all express and reasonably implied claims. You can define what you mean by claim, but remember that you need support for your claims. Amelia and Roni touched on seals. NAD has also reviewed seals and certifications in many product categories, including personal care. They have different requirements and they can communicate important information to consumers. Certifications and seals rarely appear in isolation. We have to look at them in connection with any claims that appear alongside them to determine if there are any implied claims and if those claims are supported. Any limitations on the applicability of a certification or seal should be clearly and conspicuously disclosed. In the Transfer USA seals case, NAD determined that these composite product seals did not communicate the implied message that such products are comprised entirely of fair trade certified ingredients because of the context in which they appear. They appeared alongside a prominent made with fair trade certified ingredient statement on the front of the label, as well as an ingredient list which highlighted all of the fair trade certified ingredients with an asterisk. NAD recommended that this reasoning actually applied to another case, the fair trade ingredient specific case, and that the advertiser modified the statement, quote, by choosing this fair trade certified product, you're directly supporting a better life for farming families through fair prices, etc., to make clear that the product is made with certain fair trade certified ingredients. Next slide, please. Now, in these cases, the seals or certifications relate to animal husbandry practices or environmental stewardship. They need to be based on independent scientific standards and enforced and audited by the certifier with the origins of the seal clearly identified. If the claims are tied to the certification, consumers will reasonably understand the claim to mean that the advertiser's practices are consistent with that certification, even if they don't necessarily know the specific standards that the certification requires. And if that's not the case, then the claims are not going to be supported. And as I mentioned, any limitations on the applicability of the certification or seal should be clearly and conspicuously disclosed. So for example, in the Butterball case, when the humane claims were made in close proximity to a claim about the description of the American Humane Association certification, Butterball's humane claims would be understood as claims that its practices are consistent with a reputable third-party standard represented by the seal. Based on Butterball's AH certification and its internal policies and practices, NAD determined that Butterball provided a reasonable basis for its general humane claim. That was not the case, however, for the Animal Care Certified seal in the United Egg Producers case. The NAD and the National Advertising Review Board, the NARB, which is the appellate forum for advertising self-regulation, agreed that the term means a reasonable level of humane care is provided. But there's no reference to the certifying organization or to the underlying guidelines, which could otherwise qualify that broad claim. Most recently, in the One Health case, NAD found and NARB affirmed that the advertiser's claims promoting a holistic approach to certification in context conveyed an objective message that the advertiser's certification program has high standards in each of the stated areas. Since certain claims regarding animal welfare antibiotic resistance, and environmental health were unsubstantiated, we found that the holistic claims were also unsupported. Remember that consumers will pay a premium for these products with the seals and certifications claiming a higher level of care. So it's important for the claims to be qualified and that that certification is recognized by the industry as being independent and based on a scientific standard. Next slide, please. So Roni touched on this, free of claims. These are definitely sister or cousin claims, if you will, and they inform clean because they refer to the absence of ingredients as one way of defining clean. NAD tries to harmonize its decisions with any relevant regulatory authority. For free of claims, it looks to the FTC's Green Guides, which advises that a free of claim is not appropriate if the product, package, or service contains or uses substances that pose the same or similar environmental risks as the substance that is not present. Consumers don't have the expertise to understand whether related ingredients have the same negative effect, and they have heightened concerns about ingredients in the products that they're purchasing, either because of a potential health or environmental hazard. So in the Vogue International OGX shampoos and conditioners case, one of the claims at issue was the zero SLS SLES claim. And the products contained ammonium lauryl sulfate, which is a sulfate-based surfactant like SLS and SLES. The advertiser failed to demonstrate that it's different from or that it lacks the undesirable attributes associated with other sulfates. So we recommended that the advertiser discontinue the claims that the weightless hydration coconut water shampoo has zero SLES, or otherwise implied that the shampoo contains only sulfate-free surfactants. Next slide, please. Here's a related free of claim. This is a challenge by Sanofi against Tyratech's Vamousse lice treatment products. So we found that the claims pesticide-free and no synthetic pesticides claims were supported. In doing so, we looked at consumer understanding and context. We found that consumers would not think of pesticide-free to mean that the product didn't kill lice, because that claim appeared near prominent claims that Vamousse actually does kill lice effectively. Instead, they'd understand the claim to mean that Vamousse contained different ingredients, different types of ingredients than typical lice treatment. And in this case, it did. It had homeopathic ingredients and other ingredients versus competing products that had synthetically derived active ingredients. We also found that there were no implied claims about the safety of competing products. There were no, other confounding claims or images or factors that would tie the pesticide claims to a comparative safety message. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier that advertisers are responsible for express and reasonably implied claims. Context is key. We don't look at claims in isolation, but within the four corners of an ad to determine the reasonable takeaway. So in this case, I'm going to focus on the takeaway of the natural claims made by Vogue for its Proganic shampoos and conditioners. We found that the claim high performance extracts up to 200 times more potent than their raw natural state went beyond the reference to natural ingredients to imply efficacy based on the reference to potent and then the use of an equation with the exotic ingredients added together to equal the claimed performance benefit. So while the ingredients may provide some benefits for the hair texture or color retention, Vogue didn't provide any evidence linking the specific ingredients in the product, and the amounts that they're found in the product to any benefits. Next slide, please. So in this case, this is a good case to show how the advertiser got it right. This was a monitoring case. So this was a case that NAD brought, and it's about 20% of our cases are monitoring cases. And this is against McNabb's Synology sunblock. So the active ingredients in this product are zinc oxide and titanium dioxide, both of which are FDA-approved sunscreen. The consensus in the sunscreen industry and among those who review and rate safety and effectiveness of sunscreens is to use the terms physical or natural or chemical free to describe zinc oxide and titanium-based dioxide sunscreens. So consumers choosing a natural sunscreen generally understand that they're purchasing a sunscreen with those ingredients as the active ingredients. So we reviewed the advertising claims and considered the target audience. So we found that the claim sunscreen for skin that prefers no chemicals was supported because it was immediately followed by explanatory language that its active ingredients derived from nature. Although the product had inactive ingredients that included chemicals, the advertiser clearly and conspicuously limited the main claim by adding active ingredients from nature to alert that not all of the ingredients were 100% chemical free. Also, all of the ingredients, both active and inactive, were clearly and conspicuously disclosed on the product and the product packaging. So let's switch gears now to our discussion. So Emilia, let me start with you. You have an up and coming clean or green beauty company who comes to you for advice. Why don't you walk us through how you would counsel them?
Sure. So as we started out our conversation today, there is no guiding light in terms of how to define clean in the industry, right? So if I have a company that's coming to me and what they're telling me is that we want to be a clean beauty company, one of the first things I'm going to say to them is, that's great, welcome to the industry, but let's talk about how you're going to define clean and how you're going to make it known to the market and to your consumers how you're defining clean, right? Because even Sephora, which had all the language out there about how they were going to define clean and what they were going to say to their consumers about this is what clean means to us, even they faced litigation, right? So imagine had they not taken the steps they took at the outset to say, this is what clean means to us, right? So let's get together and let's figure out how you're going to decide what clean means to you as a new market participant, right? And how you're going to articulate that to consumers. But part of that is also making sure that everybody in the brand is on the same page, right? So that all of your materials are on the same page, right? So that it's a clear message to the consumers, so that everybody is making the same message, and so that your ads are all making the same message, so that your materials are all making the same message. If you're using influencers, are they all making the same message? And so that it's coherent and it's cohesive, and that you're not making a misleading message out there inadvertently, right? And then do you actually have, I know this is not a claims substantiation program, you guys are going to do that in the near future, and I would encourage everybody to tune in for that session. It's going to be great. You have a great panel who's going to talk about claims substantiation, but just make sure you have the data to support those claims, right? So that you're not going out there and saying our products are free of X, Y, and Z when they're not. And so those are two high level things I would start out by talking to the client and making sure that everybody's on the same page about it. Roni, what else am I missing? I don't know if there are high level pieces of advice you would give to a new market participant.
No, I think you hit it right on. I think you want to introduce them to the Wild West that it is by virtue of all this. And I think that, to be kind of sobering in terms of it looks great, it's sexy, there's a growth market here, but it's not without its pitfalls. And I think it's critically important that companies, particularly those starting out, and particularly if they're new to the industry, understand fully the landscape in which they're operating, both on the regulatory front as well as on the consumer lawyer front.
And also, sorry, if I could just chime back in, Annie, that this is an ever changing, industry, right? And so you want to make sure that you keep your ear to the ground, right? There is no definition right now. I don't know that there's one forthcoming, right? But you do have MOCRA, right? And so there are regulations that are ever changing, right? So you want to make sure that you have somebody like Roni in your corner. You want to make sure that you have the right advisors to guide you, to make sure that you're not missing changes, because there are times that you could have guidance out there. Especially with things like Prop 65, especially with this proliferation of PFAS related litigation. So there are a lot of pitfalls, and make sure that you have the right people in your corner to help guide you.
Great, thank you both. What is, we'll start with you, Roni. What's one of the biggest pain points that your clients have? And, how do you try to get them, to be on the same page?
The pain points are usually all the same, but where it shows up in the timeline of conception of product to product launch depends upon the company and the manner in which they're operating. Do they have in-house legal counsel or not? But I would say by and large, the biggest pressure points that I see are between, and this is, I'm shocked if this is news to anybody, the marketing group and the regulatory group. And the marketing group going off on their own and coming up with their wish list of everything they want to say and starting to develop all this wonderful packaging and branding and everything behind it, only to then go up to the regulatory group, which puts a, stop on it and sends it back to day one. And so what I have found is incredibly helpful is, and we do this with a number of our clients, and we do it with some repeated, regularity. If it's not once a year, maybe it's every 18 months or so. We come in and we do presentations to the regulatory, marketing, and legal departments. And we update them on what is the lay of the land today. And this is really to Amelia's point, which I think is 100% spot on, which is things are evolving, they're changing quickly. And so to those of you that are listening to this podcast or webinar at some later date and time, please note that this is being given on July 18th, 2023. And if you're listening on July 19th and after, things may have changed. So please don't rely on what we're telling you. Always consult with somebody to make sure that you're still on track with what's going on in the law. But basically what I do is I bring them all together. We explain the state of the industry. We explain what the risks are. Here's what the FDA has been interested in and it's been going after. Here's what the FTC, which just recently came down with a bunch of new guidelines on using influencers and reviews. This is what they're concerned about. This is what the consumer lawyers are focused on, suing you for clean and suing you for natural. We talk about all the risks that are out there. And then we talk about the company, because every brand is different. What are their risk tolerances? The Revlons of the world and the L'Oreals of the world will have one different risk tolerance to the startup who can't really afford to hire the lawyers to defend a lawsuit. So baby, you better spend the time making sure your claims are not going to get challenged. So everybody has a different risk appetite. And within the risk appetite, understanding the risks, we then work with them to try to come up with ways in order to be able to market their brand, blow it up, make it go viral while reducing the risk of challenges. One little example of that is, for example, we've talked today about free of claims. Now, if you're going to make a free of claim, then you probably better be sure that you've tested that finished product so that if it gets tested, it is actually free of the things that you're saying are not in there. Because you can be sure that if you say free of, there's a consumer lawyer who's going to take your product to a different lab and have it tested and may come back with some small trace of what you said shouldn't be in there. So instead of free of, why don't you say formulated without? That's a way to reduce the risk while still trying to convey to the consumer the brand ethos and what they're prepared to do and what their parameters are. I'm not a marketing person, so don't trust me on that, but there are ways that we know of that we can work with those departments. And to the point that Amelia made, and it's critically important, and the reason that we go in time and again to do this is because the industry is evolving and consumer perceptions are evolving and court decisions are coming down all the time. So it's critically important that you keep up to date and make sure that what you're doing today works in the environment in which you find yourself as you're about to launch.
Anything else you want to add, Amelia?
I think Roni really nailed everything. I mean, I think to the extent that you are partnering with other companies and distribution chains, there are ways in which you can minimize risk for these types of claims, right? In your distribution agreements, you should contact outside counsel for guidance on that, right? To help ensure that you have indemnification clauses or agreements that can help mitigate the risk to you should you face one of these claims, right? Because if you're not in charge of your ingredient list, like it's a turnkey product, or you're not the one who's actually in charge of the actual formulation of the product, you need to ensure that you have certain protections in place for yourself, even though you're the one who's marketing the product. So there are all kinds of ways that you can mitigate risk. I would encourage you to speak to outside counsel about that, particularly if you're a smaller shop. We're here to help you, but I think Roni hit all the real big pain points in these types of situations.
Great.
Can I
Thank you
just,
both.
this is a little off topic, but I can't resist since we have everybody here, which is that, you know, the point was made that we were talking about how do you counsel your brand and how should they be doing things if they're up and coming and the like, and how do you as a company want to develop? I would really encourage all of us with so much going on, particularly with the passage of MOCRA, particularly with the FDA having to come up with its guidelines in terms of what's going to be going on with GMPs, particularly as relating to this conversation, its examination of PFAS and determining how are we going to do testing and what are going to be safe levels and the like. Don't only think internally in the micro about your company. This is affecting industry widely. So think in the macro. Think about coming together with different companies that you're close to. Get involved with industry organizations because PCPC, IBA, BIW, we are all at the forefront trying to communicate with FDA. So instead of having to just sit back and wait for these letters, the warning letters, the lawsuits, the demand letters, or whatever, this is an opportunity for us to really come together as an industry to be more proactive in order to be able to influence the ultimate discussion and, more importantly, the outcomes that come out of what happened because of MOCRA.
Great. Thank you both. So I just want to answer actually a quickly a question that's in the chat. If using free of is the threshold to show 0% present, or can there be a presence below parts per million? Yeah, according to the green guides, it has to be a trace amount. So so that's right. I mean, it has to be you know, infinitesimal, right? So I don't know if there's anything else that Amelia or Roni want to add to that.
You know, my concern is that a consumer lawyer is going to argue free of means there's absolutely nothing. So there should be absolutely no trace amount. And even though you might have gone out company and tested it and it came back with no detectable level, no to test, they're going to go find another lab and they're going to find a trace amount. I think it's important that you raise the FTC green guides. We are waiting for the FTC to issue updated guides. And maybe that will provide more information and more direction that will help inform decisions like this. But I can't say that there's no risk that if you're going to say something is free of something and there is trace there, I would say that there is a risk that you could get a challenge from that. Whether it would prevail and what the arguments against them would be, that's a different story. But I can't say there's zero risk if you make a, you know, free of claim and there's a trace amount that's found in there.
Great, thank you. So let's just go quickly to the takeaway slide because we have, I think, just 2 minutes left. And just wanted to leave you with these takeaways. So I'll kick it off. You know, we've talked about this throughout this webinar. Be specific, right? Avoid general clean claims. If you're making them, just define what you mean. If it's fewer ingredients, say that. If it's that you're not going to include ingredients from the environmental working groups unacceptable list, you can say that as well. So just really be sure to explain what you mean.
And to Annie's point in presentation, which I thought was really quite helpful and critically well done, be mindful. Words and images matter. You look at the context. Courts are looking at the context. Consumers are looking at the context. And again, Amelia's point and pitch for the upcoming substantiation webinar, I don't want to encroach on any of that. Just a reminder of 2 things. Number 1, you're going to have to start being able to gather the substantiation under MOCRA anyhow. You have to be able to go and explain to the FDA how everything is safe and you know that, and here's why, and here's your documentation that sits in your product dossier. You just open it up and you show it to them. But for another important reason as well, I have found that when my clients have substantiation, whether it's a consumer survey that they've done or the ingredient support or whatever the case may be, when I have that data, that substantiation, that's when I'm able to push back against the consumer lawyer. Because if we know one thing about the consumer lawyer, they are not in this to lose money. And so if they think they're going to get resistance and if they think it's going to cost them a lot of money to litigate, they're going to back off. And so the way to get them to back off before filing a lawsuit is to have in your product dossier the substantiation for the claims that you're making, and that will go far.
Yeah, and lastly, be vigilant. Just make sure that all of your team players are on the same page to avoid regulatory scrutiny and to avoid litigation. And we've talked a lot today about from the consumer perspective, because that's why we're all here, but just a pitch as well. You also want to avoid scrutiny from your competitors. Making truthful claims about your own product, about your competitors' products is just as important. So just make sure that everybody's on the same page, that you have the substantiation for your claims, as Roni just mentioned, but also that you are all on the same page about what the claim means that you are making. And I think with that, that is our presentation today. I'll hand it back to you, Annie.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yes, so here's some information about the webinar that's taking place on Thursday. Don't miss it. It's going to be excellent on substantiating claims in the beauty industry. And then next slide, we also have the NAD conference, which is coming up in September. So thank you all for tuning in today. I hope you found this to be helpful and hope to see you again very soon.